At the start of this month, Insurance Ireland launched an excellent report entitled Protecting Tomorrow. And that report takes a look at the insurance industry in Ireland today, both its domestic and international undertakings and marketplace, and it also puts it in a context of where it's come from over the last number of years. But if there was one cloud on the horizon identified in the report, it was perhaps the overhang of regulation. I'm joined by Ed Sibley, my colleague in regulation. So Ed, in the report, we identify that perhaps there's a differential or a perception of a differential standard of regulation between our domestic companies and our international companies. And is that a fair perception, or do you understand why our international companies might feel that they're regulated differently?
Fundamentally, the regulation and the approach to supervision is the same for both domestic and international players. Where it does differ is how they feel about it, because the nature of the business model, the nature of the governance arrangements, the nature of the organisational arrangements, the regulation and supervisory requirements will bite in a bit of a different way, perhaps depending on those factors. But what we can also see is, if we look at the duration that the report covers, is a tremendous effort both within Ireland and at a European level and globally for much greater degrees of harmonisation of regulation and supervision, much more consistency in the approaches to regulation and supervision for all firms, whether you're internationally focused or domestic. So a degree of difference perhaps in execution, but harmonisation being that, I think, a greater theme.
Yeah. There's perhaps one item that gets called out a little bit, and that's the individual accountability framework. Is that something of a solo run in Ireland, or where's it coming from, and why is it that we think maybe our continental colleagues might feel that's a bit of a differential standard?
Yes, it's definitely not a solo run. I think central banks looked at practices overseas, including the UK and Australia and other jurisdictions, but it's certainly not a model that's being applied in other European jurisdictions. Having said that, the aims of IAF are focused very much on governance, risk management and culture, and those are themes that are thought about at a European perspective. What we're seeing in terms of those firms that are implementing IAF at the moment, there are some advantages to implementation in terms of clarity and responsibility, and it is not causing massive disruption within those firms in terms of what needs to be done today.
Okay. And again, talking to not just IAF, but there are other regulations on the horizon, be they climate or otherwise. How can companies sort of get on top of the agenda? Like, shall we say, can you actually embrace regulation?
I mean, it is an enabler ultimately for certainly for those firms that want to operate on an international basis, but it is a big challenge. It's not, I mean, in insurance, in banking, in other sectors, the pace of regulatory change, the overarching regulatory agenda, there's a huge amount that continues to need to be done to meet regulatory requirements. Where we see the most challenges in firms is where they're taking a reactive or more tactical approach, kind of dealing with the kind of specific things that are immediately in front of them. Those firms that are finding it a little easier, kind of perhaps operating in a little bit more cost-effective way to creating more capacity for themselves to do the changes they want to, is where they're taking a more strategic approach, trying to take that kind of longer term 2, 3, 4 year view and trying to actually get to what's the intent of the regulator, what's the intent of the supervisor. And a good example of that is in relation to, say, take data. Rather than responding to individual items of regulation in terms of what's the kind of specific pieces of data, is actually really focusing on enhancing data capability, and through that enabling a kind of much more holistic approach to meeting kind of regulatory requirement.
And again, if I look forward and looking at the regulatory community, everything I see from AOPA at the moment is pointing to the need to recruit the private sector to solve the problems that we face today in terms of protection gaps, be they climate, be they cyber, be they pensions adequacy. So there is something about, at the same time as we're regulated by our regulators and supervisors, there is still a key recruitment, shall we say, of the private sector and the regulatory sector by governments to solve an awful lot of societal issues. So your perspective on that? I
mean, personally, I think two of the biggest issues that we face over the long term are the aging population in Ireland and across Europe, and climate change, and all the associated protection requirements around that. Clearly, the insurance industry has a massive part to play in that, in both those issues, addressing the gaps that are there. The fact that there are gaps today suggests that there's a huge amount of opportunity there as well from an insurance perspective. And actually one of the things that came out of the report was actually how strong Ireland is from an innovation perspective, and actually innovating well, thinking not only about what needs to be provided, but how it's provided, I think kind of really does play to Ireland's strengths.
Ed, thank you for that.
Thanks, James.